Hello, everybody. Of course, this feels a bit odd. My function today was supposed to be that of the mediator, the go-between in a discussion about the role of culture in processes of sustainable urban development. But typically enough, our contemporary culture got in the way, somehow playing out some of its more paradoxical effects on me. So, while I was supposed to provide a background to the broad theme here today, I'm now somehow stuck in that very background. Pushed away by a storm, caught in between flights, in the middle of an efficiently planned infrastructural landscape, in a hotel ironically called Connect. However, cut off from you and from this day of exchange that I had really been looking forward to, my feeling is not really that of viability, efficiency, or safety, but rather of fragility, instability, and disorientation, obviously. Shortly, I am a bit lost. So, as the flight back was finally cancelled, the crowd of passengers was transformed into what you can describe as a wind-driven mass of migrants, me included. All of us victims of a culture that we actually had planned and constructed all by ourselves. Now, there might be alternatives to the failing Connect culture, which is what I think, or which I know you are going to discuss today, and this with a point of departure in two urban settings, Malmö and Marseille, two cities which in different ways have tried to find cultural solutions in a post-industrial situation of stress and vulnerability. And when discussing culture, it is really indispensable to situate the discussion to talk about specific cultures in specific places and specific situations, since culture has to do with life and with the complexities of living. So my introduction, even though this is very important, is not really based on that kind of life, but I decided to instead briefly revisit the more formal discussion on culture and urban planning. The discussion as it has developed over the last decades. And it is a discussion circling around the question of the potential importance of culture as a sustaining, supporting, or constructive force of what is today an increasingly fragile urban construction. Important to note in this respect is that there are, in fact, many backgrounds, many ways to approach the question of culture and urban development. And what I would like to call attention to in this introduction is then the process through which the notion of culture has entered urban policy, and also the shifts that this process potentially entails, including the new demands on culture comprehension and culture competence. Next. But let's start with a reminder. The 1987 Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, and the following Rio Conference Agenda 21 program from 1992, through which the idea of an ecologically, economically, and socially defined sustainable development was more broadly introduced. Yet where, according to critics, the cultural aspect was identified only in general terms as a humanity in crisis, or in economic terms as a requirement to develop lifestyle and trading systems within the planet's ecological means. Next. These shortcomings led to the 1996 supplement, the report Our Creative Diversity, a report published by the World Commission on Culture and Development. The report, and especially the chapter Rethinking Cultural Policies, was supposed to highlight the human values that had been disregarded in the Brundtland report, consequently proposing that any development policy must take into account the totality of the cultural factors that characterize a given society. The totality of the cultural factors. So it also said culture is at the foundation of all development. Next. So this report was then the point of departure for the UNESCO conference, The Power of Culture, which was held in Stockholm in 1998, you might remember, as a part of the European Capital Culture, the Year of European Capital Culture. Next. The challenge identified here was primarily that of cultural diversity and hybridity. Cultural policies, it was stated, cannot be restricted to art and heritage. Rather, they must be linked with other domains of life, social policy, education, cultural industries, etc., and conceived of as a trans-sectorial developmental activity. Next. A publication that further inspired a broadening of the urban sustainability debate was an article published in 2001 by an Australian urbanist who proposed the inclusion of a fourth pillar in sustainability besides the ecological, economical, and social, and that is culture. The article, The Fourth Pillar of Sustainability, Culture's Essential Role in Public Planning, is considered a central reference for the development of local policies. The starting point here is the fact that culture is one of the most complex and contested concepts, and yet, or perhaps because of that, a concept that we need to revisit constantly. Despite controversies emerging here are two interrelated definitions. Next. The first is a conception of culture or cultures in the sense of patterns of life and forms of community, distinguishable through what cultural theorist Raymond Williams famously referred to as customary differences, habits, codes of manners, technologies, traditions, and institutions. And the second is a somewhat more narrow understanding, primarily referring to culture as the field of symbolic practices, the deliberate production and mediation of meanings, identities, knowledge, values, desires, and memories. There is obviously much more to culture as the fourth pillar, but I think it suffices to say, for now at least, that it was obvious already by the millennium shift, potentially due to the broad impact of new media, that a new cultural awareness was developing. Next. This is an awareness that was then even further reflected in the Agenda 21 for Culture, developed by the United Cities and Local Governments Committee on Culture. It's a declaration with 67 articles issued in 2004 and describing the relationship between local cultural policies, governance, sustainable development, and participatory democracy. Next. The Agenda 21 for Culture was actually the first worldwide document establishing principles and commitments by cities and local governments for cultural development. And today, more than 450 cities, local governments and organizations from all over the world have signed the agenda, among them Malmö, and I think also Marseille, even though it was a little bit difficult to check that out. The document was an attempt to not only point to the new central role of culture in society and the importance of interweaving cultural policies and other public policies, but also to give recommendations as to how to ensure not only a place, but a central place for culture in planning and public participation processes. Next. These ideas have since then been taken further in different contexts and by different international actors, as for example in the 2010 declaration, Culture, Fourth Pillar of Sustainable Development, the ideas of which have been further emphasized by, for example, next, the UN Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, through policy documents like the one you can see here. Next. Expressed here is the view that the planning of our common environment now should involve culture in a much more explicit way, and that culture has to be explicitly addressed in sustainable development models, since, as it is stated, culture ultimately shapes what we mean by development and determines how people act in the world. Next. Culture here appears not as an added dimension, but as an essential aspect, managing people's behavior, including their basic values. A society's values are the basis upon which all else is built. These values and the ways they are expressed are a society's culture. Next. Since there is so much to say about culture, and since culture is so much more than words on paper and phrases in documents, which, not to forget, it also is, it might seem somewhat odd or even square to prioritize policy definitions in this discussion. However, I have a reason for this, and the reason is that I think that what is reflected through these documents is a very important paradox. A paradox that is also very characteristic for the way the concept of culture is used and understood today. And the paradox is that while the everyday understanding of culture, whether broader or more narrow, has to do with people's movements, actions, and forms of expression, that is, life forms and symbolic practices continuously emerging from underneath or from within ordinary life. What is proposed in and through these documents is something else. Is culture as a tool, culture as a form of management, culture as encouraged or imposed from above, culture as a guiding and edifying force that can affect environments and inhabitants, places and people in a more or less, an appropriate way. So, while advocating for culture's role in planning, we are also developing new cultural stages, new cultures of communication, new habits, new languages, and new forms of symbolic expression. And if culture in general should be vital and inclusive, planning culture should too. These documents are, of course, all praiseworthy in their intention. Yet they also remind us about the fact that if we want to take culture seriously, it is not enough to produce new documents about culture within existing managerial structures. Instead, what is needed is a cultural awareness, an attention to the culture we are developing, also through planning, through development and policy processes. Who are taking part? Whose voices are being heard? What kind of language is being developed in this process? What forms of expressions are used? What kind of governmental culture and what forms of communication do we want? There is a culture shift taking place today, and I think it's very positive. Platforms across managerial and cultural borders are being created. Spaces for open dialogue, for creative controversies, for stimulating feedback. It is not easy, and not the least because of the increasing fragility of our infrastructural and economical systems, which so easily can lead us into motivating states of emergency, situations in which culture as a disturbance can be set aside with reference to security, to order, or to the common good. And unfortunately, I think I would like to raise this issue that we see many examples today of how municipalities, while opening up certain spaces for cultural consideration, at the same time move other sectors into the shadows of municipal corporations, förvaltningsbolag, where developmental processes can remain unaffected by culture. So even if the notion of culture is increasingly allowed to enter the urban sustainability development discussion or stage, the questions that still remain concerns the level of cultural competence, how culture is treated, and also why culture is needed, for whom and for what purpose. Cultures are not natural. They are human creations. They are imaginaries realized. However, like nature, cultures, when or if regarded simply as managerial frameworks or as infrastructural systems or as policy documents, how well designed and well ordered as they may be, will eventually hit back. And the question is, of course, and that is what I pass on to you for today, what could be done to prevent it? Thank you.